Imagine a 16-year-old girl sending a simple text message one February morning, then vanishing forever. No trace, no explanation. An entire town searching, desperate for answers. What really happened to Becky Watts shocked not only her family, but an entire country. Stay with me until the end, because this case hides some of the darkest truths you will ever hear. If you enjoy true crime stories and want to follow more real-life investigations, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Becky Watts was born on June 3, 1998, in Bristol, England, to Darren and Tanya. Her story began in an already fragile family. Even before Becky was born, her parents had separated. This early instability marked the beginning of a childhood that would often feel unstable and complicated. In her very early years, Becky lived with her mother, but the situation at home was far from stable. Concerns about neglect eventually led the authorities to place her in foster care. It was a difficult start for a little girl moving from one environment to another, but through it all, Becky remained close to her big brother, Dan. They were close, and together, they would soon move in with their father, Darren. For Becky, this new home offered more stability, even though life was far from perfect. Those who grew up around Becky described her in almost contradictory terms. With her family and closest friends, Becky was outspoken, spirited, and full of humor. She had a fighting spirit and wasn't afraid to stand her ground. She was remembered as someone who could light up a room with her energy and quick wit. She joked, teased, and laughed heartily. This was the Becky her loved ones knew best. But at school, she was different. Teachers and classmates often described her as quiet, even reserved. Yet, despite her apparent shyness, what stood out the most was her kindness. Becky had a huge heart. Teachers remembered that she always noticed when someone was sitting alone or felt left out. Instead of ignoring them, Becky would step in to make sure they felt included. This compassion defined her, and it was what made her such a loyal friend. Her friendships reflected this side of her personality. She didn't have a huge circle of acquaintances, but the friends she did have meant the world to her. Their loyalty to one another was strong, built on trust and mutual care. Becky wasn't the kind of teenager who chased after popularity. She valued genuine connections, and those close to her loved her for it. At home, life kept changing. Darren eventually started a relationship with a woman named Angie. Angie had a son, Nathan, which meant that Becky suddenly became part of a blended family. Over time, the bond between Darren and Angie grew stronger, and in 2013, they got married. It was a joyful moment for the family. The wedding photos show smiling faces and a sense of hope. Becky was a bridesmaid, proudly dressed for the occasion alongside Angie's son, Nathan, and his girlfriend, Shauna. For Darren, it was a day that symbolized new beginnings, a fresh start after years of hardship. But behind these joyful photos, subtle tensions existed. Relationships within this new family were not always easy, even if no one could have imagined just how dark things would become. For now, however, Becky was a 15-year-old teenager trying to juggle her studies, friendships, family life, and her own adolescent struggles. People who knew Becky described her as a bundle of energy, sometimes a hurricane, sometimes a ray of sunshine. She could be stubborn and spirited, but she was also gentle, caring, and full of life. She fought her own battles, like many teenagers, but she also had dreams and so much potential ahead of her. She was still only at the very beginning of her journey. Less than 2 years after that wedding, however, all those possibilities would be taken from her in a way no one could have foreseen. The young girl who brought warmth and laughter to those around her was soon to become the center of one of the most tragic cases Bristol had ever known. Becky's disappearance shook her family to its very core, because it was completely out of character for her. She wasn't the type to vanish without a trace, nor to worry people without at least a word. The morning of her disappearance, everything seemed painfully normal. She had breakfast, exchanged a few words with her father, and even laughed at something silly her little brother said. To anyone watching, it was just another day in the life of a happy teenager. But what no one could have guessed was that it would be the last time they saw her safe at home. When Becky didn't come home at the expected time, the family's first thought was that she might have been delayed, that maybe she lost track of time with friends. But as the hours stretched on, first into the evening and then into the night, their worry began to grow. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Messages were left unread. Her father, usually calm, began pacing back and forth in the house. Her mother's face grew pale as she kept staring at the clock, silently hoping the door would open and Becky would come in, apologizing for having worried them. The police were called as soon as it became clear that something was wrong. The officers first tried to reassure the family, suggesting it might be a teenage misunderstanding or that she had chosen to spend the night elsewhere. But Becky's parents knew their daughter. That wasn't like her. She was neither rebellious nor careless. She was responsible and thoughtful. With every passing hour, the weight grew heavier, and the fear that something terrible had happened began to take over. Soon, the search began. Posters with Becky's smiling face were printed and distributed. Friends and neighbors joined the search, combing the streets, calling her name, hoping she was somewhere nearby. The house, once filled with laughter, became a place of anguish and silence. Her little brother sat in his room, clutching the stuffed animal she had given him, asking questions no one had the courage to answer. The community quickly mobilized. Becky was not like other girls. She was the girl who helped her elderly neighbor carry her groceries, the one who stayed late at school to help her classmates, the one everyone seemed to know because of her warm smile. And now, she was gone. Each day without answers was a new wound for her family, who clung desperately to hope, even as the shadows of fear grew. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a nightmare from which none of them could escape. What had happened to Becky? Who saw her last? And above all, would they ever see her again? These were the questions that haunted every moment, turning their world upside down in the blink of an eye. At first, Becky's disappearance seemed like a tragic mystery that left everyone around her devastated. But as hours turned into days, the investigation began to take a new direction. The police, who had searched Becky's room, checked her phone records, and traced her last known movements, started to notice details that didn't add up. And strangely enough, many of these inconsistencies led them right back to the very place that should have been safest for her, her own home. Her family, who had been seen on television pleading for her safe return, suddenly became the center of whispers and quiet speculation. The tears, the cries of despair, all of it was convincing to the public. But for the investigators who spent hours with them, small cracks began to appear. Some family members seemed to be reciting a script, as if they were sticking to a version of events rather than naturally recalling memories. Others contradicted themselves in subtle but noticeable ways. The detectives paid particular attention to Becky's half-brother. On the surface, he was just another family member, also upset by her disappearance, but his behavior raised questions. At times, he seemed strangely detached, almost emotionless when questioned about Becky. At other times, he became defensive, even aggressive when asked about his whereabouts during the crucial hours when she disappeared. These reactions, although they could be explained by stress, did not seem normal to those tasked with uncovering the truth. The neighbors, too, began to share information that fueled suspicions. Some recalled heated arguments within the household, tensions that hinted at deeper conflicts beneath the surface of an apparently ordinary family. Others described having noticed strange movements on the night Becky disappeared, lights flickering at unusual hours, doors opening and closing when the house should have been quiet. For the investigators, the turning point came when they re-examined the timeline provided by the family. Gaps appeared, minutes, even hours, remained unexplained. How could an entire family forget where someone was during such a crucial period? Why did their answers change depending on who was being questioned? The more the detectives pressed, the heavier the atmosphere in the house became. It was as if a shadow hung over the household, each person trying to hide something, but failing through small, telling details. Every glance, every nervous pause, every contradiction only heightened the suspicions. Becky's house, the place where she should have felt safest, was no longer seen as a refuge. On the contrary, the house was becoming the center of a chilling question. Did those closest to her know more than they were willing to admit? And if so, what exactly were they trying to hide? For weeks, the community had searched, prayed, and held on to hope that Becky would walk through the door. Her family tried to stay strong, even as whispers of doubt began to circulate. But what no one could have imagined was that the truth about Becky's fate was much closer than anyone thought. It all started with small inconsistencies, stories that didn't quite match up, words spoken with hesitation, as if they had been rehearsed, but never truly convincing. The police officers, trained to notice what others overlook, sensed this unease. They began to look more closely, to ask more pointed questions, and little by little, the facade started to crack. Then came the moment that would change everything. Under the weight of the evidence, the pressure, and the guilt, someone from Becky's close circle finally broke down. The confession that burst forth was not only shocking, it was devastating. Becky's disappearance was not the result of a random crime, a stranger lurking in the night, or an unfortunate accident. It was something far more disturbing, a betrayal from within her own family. Imagine the horror in the interrogation room when those words were spoken. The police officers sat there, stunned, realizing that the unthinkable had just been confirmed. The details revealed were chilling. Becky's fate had not been sealed by the hand of a stranger, but by people she should have been able to trust the most. For the public, the news hit like a thunderclap. The image of a united, grieving family shattered in an instant. Neighbors, friends, and even close relatives couldn't understand how the same people who stood in front of the cameras pleading for Becky's safe return were actually hiding the darkest secrets. The confession not only revealed the crime, it opened wounds that would never fully heal. It forced everyone watching to confront a terrifying truth. Sometimes, the greatest dangers don't come from the outside world, but from those closest to us. And with this revelation, the case took a completely different turn. The search for Becky was no longer a matter of hope. It became a quest for justice, and this shocking betrayal would trigger a trial that would capture the attention of the entire country. The days following Becky's disappearance were filled with tension, whispers, and the heavy weight of unanswered questions. But nothing could have prepared the community or Becky's loved ones for what was about to happen next. The investigators, guided by new clues and a clearer view of the disturbing truth, began to search specific areas connected to the suspects. Their search was not random. It was calculated, methodical, and filled with dread. The police searched the woods, isolated trails, and hidden corners, places no one would ever have thought to look. Then the unthinkable happened. In a quiet and desolate place, the investigators came upon what they feared most. It wasn't just evidence, it was a chilling confirmation of Becky's fate. They discovered her brutally dismembered remains, scattered in bags, hidden as if someone had tried to erase her from existence. The discovery sent shockwaves throughout the entire country. It wasn't just a murder, it was an act of cruelty so cold and calculated that even the most seasoned investigators were shaken. The details were heartbreaking. The young girl who once laughed, dreamed, and had her whole life ahead of her had been reduced to something unimaginable. For Becky's family, the moment they heard the news was like reliving her death a second time. The grief was overwhelming, but what haunted them most was the brutality of what had been done. It wasn't just losing a daughter, a sister, or a friend, it was facing the darkest side of humanity. The media seized on the case, and the headlines reflected the horror. Across the country, people were left stunned, trying to understand how two people so close to Becky could have committed such an atrocity. Parents held their children tighter, communities closed their doors earlier, and a strange silence fell over the streets where Becky had once lived. The gruesome discovery was not just evidence in a case, it was the moment when innocence was stolen from an entire community. Becky's name became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that evil can sometimes wear a familiar face. The trial was the moment everyone had been waiting for. After months of investigation, secrets, and grief, the case finally came before the court. The air was tense, heavy with the weight of truth, lies, and the need for justice. People lined up outside, just to catch a glimpse of the trial's proceedings. Inside, the atmosphere was silent, yet charged. Every word spoken would carry immense weight. At the start of the trial, the prosecution presented its case. They presented the shocking confession, chilling evidence, and disturbing details of Becky's final moments. The jury listened attentively, some unable to hide their horror as the story unfolded piece by piece. Photographs, testimonies, and expert reports painted a dark and devastating picture. The defense, however, tried to change the narrative. They questioned the reliability of the confession, suggesting it may have been obtained under pressure. They tried to humanize the accused, portraying him as someone who had simply made a terrible mistake. But each attempt seemed to collapse under the weight of the evidence. The prosecution's case was simply too strong, too overwhelming. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Family members, friends, investigators, all adding new layers to the story. Each testimony was yet another reminder of Becky's stolen future, a new glimpse into the horror she had endured. For Becky's family, sitting in the courtroom was unbearable. Every detail was a stab to the heart, every word a reminder of their loss. The jury remained silent, taking everything in. They were the ones who bore the responsibility of delivering justice. And as days turned into weeks, the pressure grew heavier and heavier. The world outside the courtroom watched, waited, and demanded answers. Finally, after days of arguments, the case came to an end. Both sides delivered their closing statements. The prosecution demanded justice so that Becky's voice would be heard through their verdict. The defense asked for mercy, a chance to see the accused as a human being. Then, the jury was sent to deliberate. The hours felt like days. For Becky's family, every second was torture. For the accused, it was the longest wait of his life. And for the public, it was the moment of truth. The moment when the hidden horror of Becky's story would finally be confronted by justice or denial. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the verdict. The legal battle was over, and the verdict was delivered. The two people responsible for Becky's death were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The decision brought a form of legal justice, but for Becky's family, no sentence could heal the wound left by her brutal loss. The pain was permanent, a daily reminder of that young life stolen far too soon. Tributes poured in from all over the country. Becky's face, once that of a smiling teenager among so many others, became a symbol of lost innocence and a rallying cry for the protection of children. Communities organized candlelight vigils, laid flowers at memorials, and shared her story to raise awareness about hidden dangers at home. Her family vowed that Becky's memory would not be defined solely by the cruelty of her death. They began to publicly advocate for the protection of young people, speaking about the importance of vigilance and the impact of jealousy and domestic violence. Becky's name became both a warning and a symbol of resilience. The tragedy sparked nationwide discussions about the importance of protecting children, recognizing the early signs of abuse, and supporting families in crisis. Her story was shared in schools and community centers so that her life and the lessons learned from her death would not be forgotten. Although her life ended in the most horrific way imaginable, Becky Watts's legacy endures. Her laughter, her spirit, and the love of those who knew her continued to shine through the darkness. The verdict may have punished her killers, but the lasting lesson is a call for compassion, vigilance, and the protection of the most vulnerable among us. Becky's story is heartbreaking, but it reminds us just how fragile life can be and how important it is to protect those we love. Her memory lives on, not only within her family, but also in everyone who hears her story and acts to make the world a safer place. If this story moved you and you want to stay informed about real cases, mysteries, and stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Every story we share is meant to inform, warn, and pay tribute to those whose voices might otherwise be forgotten. Remember, raising awareness can save lives. Becky's legacy teaches us to never look away and to always stand up for justice. Thank you for your attention, and stay vigilant.